I think broadly people understand that pharmaceutical companies develop new molecules. You know, they might be small molecules, chemical entities, they may be proteins, they may be vaccines, but in general, they have a disease they're targeting and a molecule that they're using to target that. And 30, 40 years ago and before, pharmaceutical companies, the big giant ones, the Eli Lillys, the Mercks, the Pfizers, everything that they needed to start from discovering the chemistry and the target to bringing that drug to market and actually marketing it was all within their building. And that's how the world was. And that was fine. It was a kind of a quiet place. There wasn't a lot of fanfare given to it. The people who went into pharmaceutical research were generally not the best and the brightest in terms of the people who were going from, say, pharmacy schools or whatever like that. But it was a good industry and it was an important industry. Around that time, though, the pharmaceutical industry started to get much more focus from financial markets. These are publicly traded companies. They have stockholders. They need to report their earnings every quarter to a Wall Street audience. And CEOs of Lilly and Pfizer got tired of going out to their quarterly announcement and saying, hey, listen, we just had to lay off 300 people because the exciting project that we had to look at such and such a cancer or such and such disease didn't work or something happened, so we're going to lay these people off. So there was this constant up and down, if you will, of headcount and intensity based on where they were in projects. And what they realized was, we don't need to do it like this. What we can do is keep what we consider the core functions inside, and we can allow to spring up around us an industry called contract research organizations who takes the work that we used to do and does it for us at our direction, but outside of our doors. So if the project tanks, or conversely, if it requires 200 new hires in the next 2 months, it's not our problem. So that was really where CROs came from, and they started in the early 80s. And one of my former business partners who started the company with me, he was the president of a company called Covance, which is a pretty famous CRO, but really kind of stemmed from a very small organization called the Philadelphia Association for Clinical Trials, which kind of grew out of just a little group at Jefferson. So, you know, not unlike the situation here, and these guys recognized that there was this opportunity, networked with some people. You know, Philadelphia is one of the hubs of the pharmaceutical industry, certainly was at that time, and kind of formed this little industry, cottage industry, if you will, that was doing the things that the pharmaceutical industry no longer wanted to do. So, you know, talked about the benefits of it. It's what we do is a clinical CRO. So we take drugs that they have developed up to a point where they have proven that the target is a reasonable target, that the chemical entity has activity against the target. They've done some animal work and preclinical work that says that there's a reasonable chance that this is safe enough to at least test in humans. Once they get data here that seems encouraging enough to go ahead and pursue the humans, you file an investigational new drug application with the FDA. It's obviously a very cumbersome process and a very expensive process, so you don't do that willy-nilly. This gives you the ability to enter into human clinical trials. We'll talk more about the different kinds of human clinical trials. This is where clinical CROs live. This is what we're talking about with psychiatry and things like that. So whether it's oncology or psychiatry or anything in between, when you're doing human clinical trials, that's the bulk of what most people consider the CRO industry. In general, human clinical trials these are the three main phases. There is a fourth phase. Phase 4 studies are studies that are done in drugs that have already received approval by regulatory authorities and now they're being used for a different indication or something else. But these are the general ones. A general rule of thumb is that phase 1 trials are in healthy volunteers. These are small studies just trying to prove that the drug is safe, can be safely administered to humans. Historically, there has been no attempt to discern any efficacy from the drug in that point. If the drug proves safe in phase 1, you move to a phase 2 study, which are bigger studies involving hundreds of patients. Now you're starting to look for some effectiveness as well as continued safety. You're really looking for a dose that works here, that's both safe and efficacious. And if you're lucky enough to get that, then you move on to the big phase 3s. These are the registration trials, thousands of patients. Now you're really going against the standard of care in whatever disease you are, trying to prove in some cases that you're at least as good. Generally, particularly in this day and age, you have to prove that you're better or no one's going to really care about you. This is a very high level and making a lot of generalizations, okay? And to take it just a little bit more granular, this is now, healthy volunteers here is not really strictly true anymore. So these are still called phase 1 trials. But if you're in diseases like oncology or HIV or other life-threatening diseases with some pretty toxic drugs that you're trying to study, it's not ethical to take healthy volunteers. You need to have patients who have the disease. So generally, for oncology, for instance, these are patients who have failed everything else and really out of kind of a goodness of their heart and for mankind, volunteer to participate in these trials. They're very extremely unlikely to get any benefit from the drug they're taking, but they may be able to prove that it's safe enough to move on, and someday somebody else may get some benefit from it. In the old days, the good old days, when the pharmaceutical industry was not the focus of constant scrutiny from investors, from Congress, from insurance companies, basically what we were able to do is we had this giant integrated pharmaceutical company with tons of really smart scientists who were busy making theories about why certain targets would be good for certain diseases and why certain molecules would be good for those targets. And we're really kind of left to develop that on their own. And this is a huge, big scale thing. So at any one time in GSK or Pfizer, you may have had, 500, 1,000 different projects going on, totally different targets, different groups in different labs, really free to kind of do their own thing. Once a year, they'd report up to their department about their progress. There'd be a portfolio review. 100 of the projects would get advanced, 100 would get cut, and 300 more would go back and get some more data. That was fine. Everybody was really happy with that. If you were lucky enough to get the good animal data you needed and you went and filed your IND and FDA or EMA accepted it, you moved on and you started to involve patients. And in those days, it's not that the spirit of volunteerism was greater then, it's that the number of people who were looking for volunteers was not that great. There weren't that many targets that were making it all the way through. There weren't that many new drugs being developed. So by using really academic medical centers, primarily in the United States and then later in Western Europe, you got all that you needed in terms of patients to volunteer, to participate in your trials, and you got the answer. Now, you guys have probably seen, and I have it later in the talk about, what the funnel looks like of how many chemical entities start to end up with one drug. I mean, it's a pretty imposing number, and it's pretty daunting, really. But it didn't matter, because if you got that one blockbuster drug, if you made a Tagamet, or you made an antihypertensive drug, or you made Valium, it'd pay for everything. Nobody cared, nobody really worried about it. You could run the whole enterprise on that, and things were good. Things have changed a lot, and we're jumping ahead. It obviously didn't happen in one day, but where we are currently is, and here's kind of, so it takes 12 years, this process in general. So obviously we've just really kind of been very casual about talking. It goes here and there. This is a big, long process that ends up involving hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals across, from chemists and biologists to everybody in between, nurses, doctors. It's a huge process. And it was really not very efficient. It isn't very efficient. It's a very resource-intense process, and it doesn't often result in those great therapies that people love to talk about. This fact here, this is the likelihood that the drug will reach the market, 16%, means this is the drug that's already gone through all those earlier steps and has gotten through to the IND stage. This isn't talking about literally the hundreds of things that fell apart the first time you put it into a rat, or you couldn't make it, or it was insoluble, whatever. So even 16% is a pretty low hit rate when you're talking about things that cost so much. And some current data says that the average cost to develop and market one drug, this process, is about $2.5 billion. That's been getting more and more daunting as cost becomes more and more of an issue. And it's also becoming more and more daunting because the chances of getting the blockbuster that can pay for just pay for everything else is getting less and less. Now we have payers who are insisting that they will only pay X amount for this. They're not going to pay $1,000 a month, whatever it is like that. So these opportunities to really make it all back on one have been greatly limited. And it really forces us to do a lot of different things to try and keep up. One of the main things that it forced the industry to do is to give up their giant science house, if you will. So the big pharmaceutical companies, again, that were fully integrated, they gave up maybe some of the clinical trial work to CROs 30 years ago. But what they've given up a lot more now. And what they've given up now is most of that early science. And what modern pharmaceutical companies, big pharmaceutical companies have become are experts in doing the giant phase 3 registration trials, which are, they can involve 20, 30,000 patients, and they're a heavy lift. And they're incredibly good, as anybody who watches TV ever knows, at marketing. That's really the core competence of big pharmaceutical companies now. And they have pared down their size. And the one group that's gotten really big in there is a group called, in different places, business development or portfolio management. And what those guys are doing is they are keeping their ear close to the ground for the literally thousands of little pharma and biotech companies who are now taking on that innovative science as their one project. They have the world's experts right in their lab. It's no longer feasible or even desirable for Pfizer to bring them in. Pfizer says, go and do your work. And if something comes out of your early work that looks appealing to us, we'll be happy to pay a very nice premium to you to bring that in, do the phase 3s and market that drug. So really what has happened in modern drug development is big pharmaceutical companies have become marketers and phase 3 registration trial experts. And the bulk of the innovative science is being done in small 10-person companies, around the world. Certainly a lot here in Cambridge and Boston. Philadelphia is full of them. Austin, Texas, London, England, where they're focusing on really one theory. And they're generally privately funded. They raise money from venture capital firms and private equity firms with the idea that they can take their idea to some proof of concept that is appealing to big pharma companies. Some of them still want to go to an IPO and become that giant pharmaceutical company, but it's rare. It really is. And when a big pharmaceutical company with deep pockets comes to you at the end of phase 2 and says they want to give you $1 billion, it's pretty hard to say, no, we think we can make 10 billion by just doing our own phase 3. When you're not equipped to do that and you have investors who say, I'd like my money back, thank you very much. So it's a totally different world. And from a CRO point of view, we don't care. We're doing the clinical trials. We don't care if it's XYZ Biotech with 3 guys in their garage, or if it's GlaxoSmithKline. If you need a trial done, we're the people to do it for you. There's a lot of competition. So the diseases that have a high unmet medical need, there's a lot of people chasing that. And it's not good enough to say, I'm going to chase non-small cell lung cancer, and if my drug works, I'm going to be a billionaire. There's 40 companies chasing non-small cell lung cancer. And they have fractionated into different genotypes and things like that. So this is not to be taken on lightly. And of course, there's more regulation. The regulations and the hoops that companies are forced to jump through by FDA, not to mention insurance companies and payers, is something we've never seen before. And we're never going back to the old days. This is the new reality, and we have to deal with it. One of the biggest factors that contribute to that $2.5 billion price tag, probably 70% of that number is the clinical trials when it all gets said and done. So a lot of the chemistry work and the biology work and the lab and the rats, they cost money, but they're not backbreaking. When you get to clinical trials, because it's so highly regulated, because the trials have to be all over the world and recruit all these people, it's a very expensive proposition. And so when you're an industry who's being cost constrained, you want to look at trying to keep your costs down, really one of the first places you have to look is patient recruitment. We got to go faster. Time is money in all of life, but really in the pharmaceutical industry, time is really money because, we didn't get into this, but when you file your drug initially, when you file a patent with your drug and it's approved, your patent life starts ticking, and it's 17 years. So you can see it takes an average of 12. So that means you've got 5 years to recoup all this before somebody, knocks off your drug for 1/10 the cost, and some insurance company makes a doctor then prescribe the cheaper generic just to save money. So patent life is everything in pharma. So time is money, more than money is money. So that has kind of led, okay, how can we recruit faster? This is a number that probably hasn't changed over the last 30 years. Clinical trials are complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. You have to find investigators who are willing to do your trial. You then have to negotiate with them and their university. So they're 3 months behind schedule, and yes, contracting and things like that are a big issue, but the biggest issue is there's just not enough patients. We talked about non-small cell lung cancer. If there's 50 trials chasing non-small cell lung cancer, there's not that many newly diagnosed non-small cell lung cancer patients in any one physician's practice, and it gets to be kind of daunting. So that has led us to kind of try and come up with innovative ways of driving recruitment. And so circling back to what I was talking about at the beginning, when we formed our company, our CRO, it wasn't about we want to be another US CRO and do the same thing that 20 other people are doing. Our play was to really try to capitalize on Asia, and particularly India, as a new source of patients for clinical trials. The diseases are generally occurring at roughly the same frequency that they do in the United States and Western Europe, but you're talking about 1 billion people, so the denominator is greater and much less competition. Why don't people volunteer for trials? This number is about constant over the last 30 years. Why do only 10% of patients these are patients who are eligible, enroll in clinical trials? I mean, it's the lifeblood of what we do. We need this. How come? Why is this? Particularly for serious diseases, if you've just been told by your physician that you have non-small cell lung cancer, and in the next sentence is, hey, do you want to volunteer to be in a clinical research program? You're dealing with a lot. And if you start to think about, well, okay, that might help me, and this and that, I said, well, you're probably not going to get any benefit from it. It hasn't been proven. And, you might have a 50% chance that you're going to get placebo or a drug that's been proven to not work as well. I know myself, if God forbid if that were me or my family member, I'd probably say the same thing as, what, let me get what works and we'll let the next guy take care of this. And so this is an issue that we're dealing with, we're dealing with now, we will continue to deal with forever, and we need to come up with smarter ways to do this. So if you knew that the chances that this could work for you wasn't 10%, but it was 80, or that it was 100% safe in you because of you were genotyped or whatever, this conversation would be a lot easier. The trial could be a lot smaller, the answer could be ascertained a lot faster, yes or no, and we'd all be better off. That's been the holy grail for our industry for a long time. We're closer to it than we've ever been, but we're not there yet. So in phase 1 studies, the quote-unquote healthy volunteer studies that we're talking about, you can pay volunteers to participate in those. That's not considered to be an inducement. And frankly, one of the biggest markets for these kind of things, and you guys may even be aware of it, is on college campuses and medical school campuses, where somebody says, hey, you want to take this drug and come in and get your blood drawn and you'll get $200 or something like that. It's good money. I mean, I know a lot of my pharmacy school classmates did a lot of that. You know, there's a lot of rules about it. You can't do it too often and this, that, and the other thing, but it's a legitimate thing to do, and you can pay those patients. However, once you get to phase 2 and 3 studies where there is a potential benefit that could be gained because of efficacy, it is considered unethical to pay those patients. You can reimburse them for the time if they have to come to your clinic more often than they would otherwise. You can pay for their parking or if they had to stay overnight in a hotel, but you're not allowed to give them any money. So we talked about expanding the foreign markets, and that's great. You know, as our country here becomes more heterogeneous, we need to generate data on all kinds of people, not just, you know, Caucasian people, or not just, you know, so that's helpful in that respect. But again, it leads to other issues in terms of the complexity of that trial and trying to get the same protocol approved in Mumbai, India, and Oslo, Norway, and Nashville, Tennessee. You know, there's some cultural differences there that you really, so it makes the whole thing, needless to say though, that's what we've done, and we blanket the world trying to find the right patients for the right trials. But yeah, let me just digress here. Some of these slides are a little bit, I don't want to touch on all these things. I just want to say, go back again to what we were doing when we were into pharm before InClinica and really working in India and Asia. We had 3 kinds of companies approach us about working in India or working in Asia. The first kind of company said, listen, I know clinical trials are really expensive, and I know they're probably 40% cheaper if we do them in India, so we want to work there. That's great. My general reaction to those kind of folks was, if that's your primary and only motivation, you may not want to do that. This is going to be an incredibly long and difficult slog, and if all you're looking for is to save a little bit of money, you're probably going to feel like you didn't get your money's worth at the end of it, because you're going to be doing a lot of work. The second kind of people said, listen, I want to go over there because, as we referred to before, not only am I going to save money on the cost of clinical trial, but I'm going to save time because you're going faster. And I understand time is really my thing, whether it's my patent life or how long it takes me to negotiate a deal with a big pharma. That's a big issue for me. Those people were smart, and I really enjoyed working with them because now they're starting to get it. The third group, the really kind of sophisticated ones who get it, said, okay, yes, it's cheaper. Yes, it's faster. But guess what? I want to sell my drug in those markets. That's the only place in the world where drug sales are increasing. If you look at statistics, drug sales in the US are flat. The dollars aren't, but the absolute number of prescriptions are. Europe, it's negative. The growth is in Asia. And so the really perceptive group said, listen, I'm using this data to get my drug approved in the US and Europe, but I'm also using it to get approved in India and Malaysia and China, because that's where the real growth is. And those were the companies, I think, that derived the most benefit and consequently had the most satisfaction from doing that. And those are the ones we really like to work with.